lost our feed. Back up? Okay, here we go. So, he said the drive for success was on. I'd prove to the world I was important. My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people made money, many people lost money, but some became very rich. Why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wife. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceived their best projects when drunk, that the most majestic constructions of philosophic thought were so derived. Anybody ever feel like that? I feel like, yeah, I was better when I was drinking, or better if I smoke a joint, I was more creative, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Get so much done.
Bunch of baloney, right? All right. So he says, by the time I had completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in its grip. Do you know what maelstrom means?
Can you elaborate?
Huh?
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, it's turmoil. So he really liked that turmoil, chaos. Yeah, that chaotic sense. Yeah. Yeah, he was fascinated by that. He said the inviting maelstrom, which is turmoil of Wall Street, had me in its grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge the weapon that would one day turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. Do you know what $1,000 would be like today compared to 1929?
Like 10,000, right?
Gosh, I'd say at least.
100.
I don't know.
I don't think it would be like that. I think it'd be probably about 10,000 something.
I mean, 1929, you could probably buy a car for $600, you know, and today it's what?
20
I
grand.
mean, 26,000 is a cheap car, right? So what's that, like 4 times? So I would say, you know, that's at least, I don't know, 4,000, 10,000. It was a lot of money.
15 grand.
15 grand. Good job. All right. So I mean, so that was no amateur undertaking. I mean, that was a significant thing to do, right? So that tells you a lot about this guy, that he was no floozy, you know. So he says, it went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined that they would one day or someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and managements, but my wife and I decided to go anyway. I had developed a theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on. He says, we gave up our position and off we roared in a motorcycle, the sidecar stuffed with tent, blankets, and a change of clothes, and 3 huge volumes of financial reference. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Now think about it. I mean, here he takes this ambitious move to travel around the country, and what's he say? He says, perhaps they were right. I had some success at speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. At the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there, and the use of a large expense account. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. So he took off on a journey around and visiting these factories to gather information to take back to Wall Street to sell to brokers on how they would invest. I mean, he did this on his own accord. Nobody paid him to do this. This wasn't a job that somebody said, here's a job for you. You go do this and I'll give you this, right? So he was what? He was a very visionary man. He was very, what? Risk-taking, right? Okay? So I just want you to see who this guy was. So it says for the next few years, Fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important and exhilarating part in my life. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spent in thousands and chattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. You know what the scoff means? To mock, to make fun of, right? Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weather friends. My drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row. Remonstrances means objections. The remonstrances of my friends terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. Okay? So, what did he start to do? He started to isolate, right? Lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. It says in 1929 I contracted golf fever. We went once to the country. My wife to applaud while I started out to overtake Walter Hagen. You know who Walter Hagen was. He was a golf pro, right? Very, very, very well-known golf pro. It says liquor caught up with me much faster than I came up behind Walter. He said I began to be jittery in the morning. Golf permitted drinking every day and every night. It was fun to caroon around the exclusive course which had inspired such awe in me as a lad. He caddied as a lad. Okay, so that's his connection to the golf course. Okay, as a lad. He said I acquired the impeccable coat of tan which one sees upon the well-to-do. The local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. I relate to that because I remember in the late stages of my addiction, I remember going to the bank to try to cover checks that I had bounced, right? And it was like the weekend I'd go out and blow a bunch of money and end up Monday morning owing a bunch of money, but Monday I'd go sell a job and I'd take that check to the bank, and I can remember wondering what the tellers, the women at the bank, thought about me, you know, when they would see the balances on my account and then me there to make it all up. So he says, I relate to that when he says that the local banker watched me whirl fat checks in and out of his till with amused skepticism. It was abruptly in 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ-32. It had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. That disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. My friends had dropped several millions since 10 o'clock. So what? Tomorrow was another day. As I drank, that old fierce determination to win came back. Anybody relate to that?
Yeah.
Remember, think about it. I can remember screwing up things and destroying a bunch of money and walking off a job and going to the bar and thinking, screw that guy anyways. I'll get a better job tomorrow, you know? Yeah. Okay, abruptly in October 1920, I went back. Next morning, thank you, I telephoned my friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I'd better go to Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena for me, but drinking caught up with me again, and my gorgeous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. Does anybody know the story that he's referring to about Napoleon and Elba and St. Helena? Nate, are you a historian like that?
Napoleon was jailed on an island, so assuming it.
Yeah, he was ostracized to. Napoleon was ostracized to St. Helena, right? and I don't know exactly why, but he was ostracized.
Elba would have been like a conquest.
So, yes,
Like a fight.
I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. I'm not certain, but I just wanted to give you some context to that. I'm not a historian. All right, so he says, we went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job, then lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. I mean, think about it, you know. Here, I got a job, and instead of just going to work and going home, I've got to pick a fight with a taxi driver, right? That sounds as alcoholic as, that's just as good a description of the things that I would do. I mean, can you relate to that? Yeah. Yeah, so he says, mercifully, no one could guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years, or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. I became an unwelcome hanger-on at brokerage places. You know where I became an unwelcome hanger-on at? Bars, crack houses, friends' houses, people. Yeah, I was like, man, would you just leave? You know? But see, here's what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is I can't relate to being a hanger-on at a brokerage house, right? But I can relate to being an unwelcome hanger-on at. I remember going to friends of mine's that owned cabinet shops, you know, and going there to drink with them, to drink their beer after work, right, with them, and I can relate to that, an unwelcome hanger-on, right? Liquor ceased to be a luxury; it became a necessity. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay the bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by a half-dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nonetheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. Gradually, things got worse. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point in 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. So here he had it. He had it all set up. All I got to do is show up. But he couldn't show up, right? I couldn't show up because I got drunk. I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw that I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. But then I had written a lot of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk again. Again, you know, so you see the cycle again and again and again and again.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. This time, I know what I did last time, but this time I mean business. This time I'm not doing it. I'm not gonna drink again, right?
I could write that on my
It's gonna be
forehead.
different this time.
Right. Yeah, it's gonna be different.
This time it'll be. You'll see. I'll show you. Yeah.
It was more like, even though I was like saying that to like the people who, you know, knew I was doing it, it was more like I was saying it to myself. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, you know, like
The
I
little
was-
boy whistling in the dark
Right. Yeah.
to keep up his spirits. Right. Convinced me. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Somehow, someone had pushed a drink my way. I had taken it. Was I crazy? I began to wonder. For such an appalling lack of perspective seemed being just that. Renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed, and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I'd manage better the next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then. And I did. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I remember waking up in the morning, after being on a binge for several days, and the sun had come up, and just pulling the covers and the pillow over my head and just burying my head under I couldn't stand to see the light. It was like, God, could it just be dark again? I can't, because I can't face another day, I relate to that. The remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. I don't ever want to forget that. He said, I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. The morning paper told me that the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin had fixed that. So 2 bottles in oblivion. The mind and the body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. So that's what, say he talked about he didn't work for 5 years, didn't draw a sober breath for 5 years, and this is another 2 more years. 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again I swayed dizzily before an open window, or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a week. He's trying to say that I wanted to kill myself, but I didn't have the courage, if that's what that takes. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish I feared I would bust through my window, sash and all. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with heavy sedative. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. This combination landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity. So did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. My brother-in-law was a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that, though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill, bodily and mentally. It relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months the goose hung high. I went to town regularly, even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. But it was not. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. After a time I returned to the hospital. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain, perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. It was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself, my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Remember that guy that was going to take over the world? It was going to lead him to control vast empires in the beginning of his story, right? Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before me. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. No words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched all around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. That's defeat, isn't it? Complete defeat. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. I think it's important to look at that statement. Fear sobered me for a bit. Because I think fear can have an influence upon you staying sober. I think there's a beneficial piece to the fear, but I don't think it'll keep us. If you are a real alcoholic of the hopeless variety, I don't think fear will keep you sober long term. Said fear sobered me for a bit, but here it is. Then came the insidious insanity of the first drink. Remember we talked about all the different parts of that insanity last week, the peculiar mental twist, the like he states it here, the insidious insanity, that thought that precedes the first drink, that subtle insanity. It says, then came the insidious insanity of the first drink. On Armistice Day, 1934, I was off again. So here he goes again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call a fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and unselfishness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through the night and the next day. Anybody ever hide their drinks? Anybody ever hide their dope? Oh, we got a bunch of hands going. Okay. So can you relate to this? Okay. Oh, I got this over there. You ever find anything that you stashed later? Right. Okay. All right. So you relate to this guy, right? All right. I just want to make sure I was in the right room. Okay. So concealed about the house to carry me through the night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember him coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. Of course, he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. And I want to stop with that idea. This is obviously he's talking about Evie Thatcher at this point, and how I relate to that idea of recapturing the spirit of other days was, I have a cousin, but my cousin, my age, he was raised here in Hamilton. We grew up together. We're, 9 months apart in age, a little less than that. And, obviously when we were in our teens, we started drinking and using together. And I went in and out of recovery for a number of years. And many, many occasions upon relapsing were with my cousin. And the idea that I came to in understanding what was happening between he and I was afraid that when I got sober this time, I didn't re-engage with him for a couple of years because I was really afraid of being with him and relapsing again, right? And what I discovered was that what I tried to do every time that we were together was I wanted to recapture that spirit of other days. I didn't know how to move forward in my relationship to him. The only way that I knew how to relate with him was to go back into drinking and using. And so most of the time when I got together with him, that's what happened. And that's what was happening, was I was trying to recapture the spirit of other days, and I was afraid to move forward in my relationship with him. Go ahead.
When I lived in the apartment over there.
Speak up a little.
So when I lived in the apartment over there,
Uh-huh.
and relapsed, I've read this obviously, but I've kind of overlooked that. But I feel like that's exactly what happened, because I reached out to an old friend, and I've always wondered what my emotional tie to this person was. He's like been one of the hardest people for me to move forward with. I have a lot of struggles with thinking about him, and I love him very much, and I recognize we're not good for each other, but I feel like that's what was going on when I reached out to him, is I wanted our old friendship back before things got spoiled,
Right.
I fell off a cliff immediately.
I think that it's very common for us to not know how to move forward in relationships and change them. That we want to go back and, like it says, recapture the spirit of other days. I wanted that feeling, I wanted that connection back, and I didn't know how to get it in a different way without drinking and using. And I'll tell you the story since. After 2-3 years of sobriety, I started making short visits to my cousin, and I started to develop a new way of relating with him that didn't include drugs and alcohol. And he doesn't have what I have, okay, and so it's not a problem for him. It wasn't his problem; it was mine. And so today we enjoy a really amazing relationship, and I go spend weeks at a time with him and his wife at this point. When I go to Florida, I stay with them often. So, and it's not an issue today. So, all right. There was so after that, the thought of only recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a JAG. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. That very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. The door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed, but curious, I wondered what had gotten into the fella. He wasn't himself. "Come, what's all this about?" I queried. He looked straight at me. Simply but smilingly, he said, "I've got religion." I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, all right. But bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how 2 men had appeared in court, persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was evident. It worked. He had come to pass his experience along to me, if I cared to have it. I was shocked but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays, way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good-natured contempt for some church folk and their doings, his insistence that the Spears really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. his fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. So what do you think he's talking about in all that? Let's kind of pull it apart. Okay, so a proffered temperance pledge. What's that? Temperance pledge. Not to drink? That's what I think it is. Okay? That proffered temperance pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good nature's contempt of some church folk. So his grandfather had a issue with organized religion or formal Christianity, right? He's like, he says the Spears had their music, but he denied the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. So he was like, I might believe in this, he said, but I may not believe in it your way, right? So he was a bit of a rebellious spirit, maybe, right? His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died, these recollections welled up from the past. So he was thinking about what? What do you think he's thinking about there?
His past religious experience.
Past religious experience, ideas, teachings, influences.
He's pretty much discrediting it in his head, like discrediting that dude had found religion and it changed him. Like that's how I see it.
Or he's challenging, or he's being challenged. His former ideas about God are being challenged, I think, in this. Because it's like, I'm hopeless, I can't stay sober, and here's this guy sitting across the table from me that is sober, that said that I got religion, right? So I think he's got this conflict that's going on inside of him right then and there, right? You see that? Let's read a little more. He said, that wartime day in the old Winchester Cathedral came back again. So remember he said, I wandered inside the cathedral, much moved. I wandered outside, he said. Much moved, meaning something stirred on the inside, right? Do you think that could be his connection to what he could conceive of as a higher power or God or something? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah.
I think so. He's reflecting to that. He said, he says, I had always believed in a power greater than myself. I had often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemist and the astronomers, even the evolutionist, suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay it all. How could there be so much precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe, who knew neither time nor limitation, but that was as far as I'd gone. So I think from the time that he's talking about when he was at war and his experience at the cathedral to this period, he's never really spent a lot of time thinking about this idea of God. Right? Isn't that kind of what he's saying? Is that what you're gathering from that? Okay. It says, with ministers in the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. To Christ, I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him. His moral teachings most excellent. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult, and the rest I disregarded. The wars which had been fought, the burnings and chicanery of religious dispute had facilitated, made me sick. I honestly doubted whether on balance the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging from what I had seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. That means not. The brotherhood of man, a grim jest. Just joke, right? If there was a devil, he seemed to be the boss universal, and he certainly had me. But my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. That's the first step, right? Second step. I can't. God can. No human power could have relieved our alcoholism, but God could and would if he were sought. His human will had failed. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. I think that's beyond hopeless, isn't it? Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised up from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute. And this was none at all. That floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in a human heart which had done the impossible. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great things. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on different footing. His roots grasped new soil. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, and spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. My friend suggested that what then seemed like a novel idea. He said, "Why don't you choose your own conception of God?" Wow. That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Under a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Thus, I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last, I saw, isn't that amazing though, the transition that he just made? He said that, back a minute ago, he said that he would choose this own power greater than himself, right? And then all of a sudden, right here, he says, thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. Interesting, wasn't it? It was a pretty quick transition. At long last I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. The real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself, and it had been ever since. How blind I had been. So let's go back and think about this a little bit. So he went to England. He was in the war, right? And during that movement or rotation or whatever it was that he was serving, he went to that cathedral and something really profound happened for him inside that cathedral. And he says here, he said, for a brief moment I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. But see what he's telling you. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. So something happened significant for him in that cathedral that day. You see that? You see what he's telling you? He said, but soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those of within myself, And so it had been ever since, how blind I had been. Okay? At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens, DTs. There I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care. Third step, right? I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. What's that, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, right? I have not had a drink since. My schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems. What's that? Problems and deficiencies. 8 steps, 5 and 6 at least, right? Problems and deficiencies. We made a list of people I had hurt, toward whom I had felt resentment. 8. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. 8 and 9. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Steps 9. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. Then only might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure. Now, I got to tell you, I don't take exception with many things in the book, but I do take exception with that statement. And when he says, never was I to pray for myself, I pray for myself. I don't pray for Cadillacs and dancing girls anymore, okay? But I pray for the perfect opportunity, if it's for work. I pray for God to guide me in directions that will make my life complete, so that I can in turn give to others as well. There's nothing selfish in my understanding about that. I understand what he's saying here, never was I to pray for myself, except on my request bore upon my usefulness to others. I take exception with that. It's one of the very, very, very few things in this book that I would take exception with. My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator. So he said new relationship, not the old relationship, but a new relationship with my Creator. That I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. Interesting. Not just the drink problem, right? Answered all my problems. Belief in the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. Simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light, who presides over us all. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity that I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. So he had a very, very powerful experience in the hospital, right? Okay. We call it his white light experience, or there's been other names for it, but he had a very, very powerful experience with his higher power, the God of his understanding, in that hospital. For a moment, he says, I was alarmed and called my friend, the doctor, to ask if I were still sane. He listened in wonder as I talked. Finally, he shook his head, saying, something's happened to you and I don't understand. But you had better hang on to it. Anything that's better than you were. The good doctor now sees many men who have such experiences. He knows that they are real. While I lay in the hospital, The thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. Now, I've read in some history books, and I think we might even I might even have some of that. That I think this idea that he's talking about that came to him was given to him by Dr. Silkworth. Okay, I believe that, and I think I've got some history books that will substantiate that. But at any rate, I'll go on. He says, my friend had emphasized here it is. This is Evie telling him the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. There it is. Faith without works was dead, he said, and how appallingly true for the alcoholic. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. So that's the answer. That's the 12th step, right? If he did not work, he would surely drink again, and if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. With us, it is just like that. My wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics to a solution to their problems. It was fortunate for my old business associates remained skeptical for a year and a half, during which I found little work. I was not too well at the time, and was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. This sometimes nearly drove me back to drink, but I soon found that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. Many times I have gone to my old hospital in despair. On talking to a man there, I would be amazingly lifted up and set on my feet. It is a design for living that works in rough going. We commenced to make many fast friends, and a fellowship has grown up among us, of which it is a wonderful thing to feel a part. The joy of living we really have, even under pressure and difficulty. I have seen hundreds of families set on their feet in a path that really goes somewhere, have seen the most impossible domestic situations righted, feuds of bitterness of all sorts wiped out. I have seen men come out of asylums and resume a vital place in the lives of their families and communities. So we don't come out of asylums today. What do we come out of today? Rehab. Right. Rehab, detox, right? So vital lives of their families and communities. Business and professional men have regained their standing. There is scarcely any form of trouble and misery which has not been overcome among us. In one western city and in its environs, there are 1,000 of us and our families. We meet frequently so that newcomers may find the fellowship they seek. That's why we meet, okay? We'll read that again. We meet frequently so that newcomers may find the fellowship they seek. At these informal gatherings, one may often see 50 to 200 persons. We are growing in numbers and power. An alcoholic in his cups is an unlovely creature. Our struggles with them are variously strenuous, comic, and tragic. One poor chap committed suicide in my home. He could not or would not see our way of life. There is, however, a vast amount of fun about it all. I suppose some would be shocked at our seeming worldliness and levity, but just underneath there is a deadly earnestness. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us, or we perish. Most of us feel we need to look no further for utopia. We have it with us right here and now. Each day my friend's simple talk in our kitchen multiplies itself into a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, died January 24th, 1971. Time is it? Time we got? 6:59. Wow, that was like to the money. I wanted to share a little bit from a book. It's called Evie, the Man Who Sponsored Bill W. by Mel B. I heard Mel talk out in San Antonio at the last at the World International 10 years ago, and he's a great historian. We'll do that next week. I think that's what we'll start out with. It's his account of Ebby and Bill's interaction in the beginning, and it's much more detailed. And I think it'll be interesting for you. So,
Did Abby stay sober?
Ebby never did. Ebby died. My understanding was he died with about 3 years of sobriety. Interesting story. He never stayed sober. He continued to relapse for the rest of his life until, like I said, about that last 3 years. There was a woman who was an old timer that knew Bill and Ebby and Dr. Bob, and she talked out in San Antonio too, and she said that at Ebby's funeral, there were only 12 people that attended that funeral because Ebby felt like he never really got the credit that he should have gotten for Alcoholics Anonymous. And so he really ostracized himself from everyone and alienated himself from most people. My understanding was that he was a very bitter and angry man. And it was interesting because she said, I asked Bill, she said, you know, Bill, you've been afforded this grace when you got sober to stay sober, you know, for all of these years. She said, what do you think would have happened if Ebby had received that grace? And she said, Bill stopped and he thought about it for a moment and he said, you know what? He said, I might not have made it. Because it was the continual struggle. You know, when Ebby would relapse, Bill would go find him, he'd search him out, he'd go to the bars, he'd get him sober, he'd sober him up. And yet he called Ebby his sponsor, right? Because of how much Ebby gave him, you know. And he said, you know, had it not been for that struggle that was in front of me relative to Ebby, he said, I don't know, I might not have made it. I thought that was a real interesting thing, you know.
Yeah, that's deep.
I mean, it's sad, you know, because there are a lot of Ebbies amongst us, you know. I really thought that was my plight. I struggled and struggled in and out for like 12 years, you know, and I didn't know that I could ever really stay sober again. I thought I might be like Ebby, that I just struggle on with, you know, periods of sobriety, and that was the best I could get, you know. So I was scared for a long time, but anyways, yeah, we'll read that next week, and I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy understanding a little more depth about their connection, how they connected, and so forth. So, all right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.